Hello and welcome. This is News Club UK, a weekly panel show that goes where others don't or won't, especially the establishment media. I'm your host, Thomas Barlow, and this week we are joined by an excellent array of guests to kick everything off. This is going to be absolutely fantastic. I've got with me today Natalie Bennett from the Green Party. I've got Roshan from the Green New Deal, Stephen Colgrave from Byline Times, and Rob Edwards from the Ferret. So let me give you a little introduction to our guests, and then let's talk about some of the stories that we're going to be chatting about this week, because this is a weekly panel show with a difference. We're going to talk to activists, organizations, and independent media that don't usually get their voices heard in the establishment. So we're really, really excited to be doing this. And yes, as I say, let me introduce you to our guests this week. We have Natalie Bennett from the Green Party. Baroness Bennet of Manor Castle is a British politician and journalist. She led the Green Party of England and Wales from September 2012 to September 2016, and she led the party to their highest ever vote share in 2015. Bennett was given a peerage in Theresa May's 2019 resignation honours and is now an MP in the House of Lords. And we're going to be getting a bit of frontline gossip from there, aren't we? Hopefully today. Next, we have Roshan, an activist from the Green New Deal. He's an activist for climate and refugee justice. He's a member of the Green New Deal UK and co-founded Sheffield's first refugee sponsorship group, Steel City Welcome. Hello to you, Rosh, as well. Looking forward to getting into your story later today. We're going to be kicking off with you. Next, we have Stephen Colgrave. Stephen Colgrave co-founded Byline Festival, Byline Times, and Byline TV with Peter Jukes, and is one of the executive editors of Byline Times, along with Peter Jukes. They founded the paper roughly 20 months ago, and its daily news site has up to 1.5 million readers a month, and the monthly newspaper has over 10,000 subscribers. I thoroughly recommend it as well. Please do subscribe to Byline Times. Stephen has variously been a punk musician, advertising executive, film producer, author, nightclub promoter, and gallerist. So a range of experiences to draw upon here when we get into Stephen's work later on in the show. And finally, let me introduce last but not least, Rob Edwards from the Ferret. Rob Edwards has been an environmental journalist in Scotland for 40 years, writing for a wide range of publications, including The Guardian, New Scientist, Scotland on Sunday, and the Sunday Herald. He is now writing for Scotland's investigative journalism cooperative, The Ferret, of which he's a director and co-founder, an excellent organisation. And again, we're really excited to be getting into Rob's work later today. Hello, Rob. Good to see you. Okay, so today we've got a great array of things to talk about, and we are going to start off with discussing the US elections. And we're going to try and take a slightly different tack, and we're going to talk about the Green New Deal in perspective of that, and also what lessons can be learned from what occurred there. Then we are going to be going on to talk about the Ferret's excellent work in Scotland, specifically a report, an investigative piece done on the destruction of marine wildlife in Scotland, the kind of journalism we at News Club want to promote more of and we want to see more of. After that, we're going to be talking with Stephen Colgrave about why we need a civil service when we've got perfectly good management consultants. And finally, we are going to be talking about the Internal Markets Bill with Natalie Bennett and the Lord's rebuke over the Internal Markets Bill, and hopefully some frontline gossip from what's happening in the Lords around the Brexit negotiations. I am going to be trying to be the voice of a fairly agitated audience throughout this, just to try and get the best out of our guests. But do trust me when I say we should be checking out their organisations, joining, getting involved. I'm really excited to have them on board. I'm happy to introduce Rosh. How are you doing, Rosh?
Good to be here.
Excellent. I'm glad to have you here as well. Now, if it's okay with you, I'm going to introduce your story and the one you've picked this week. The Democrats will suffer if they abandon the Green New Deal. And then we can get some of your thoughts and opinions on why you think this piece is relevant and important, and what it says is interesting. And the US elections more generally. Then we'll bring everyone else in. So the Democrats will suffer if they abandon the Green New Deal. Did Joe Biden's much publicized suggestion that he wanted to transition off fossil fuels during a presidential debate cost him the election? Evidently not. Biden is projected to flip Pennsylvania with a healthy margin, and he carried fossil fuel producing states New Mexico and Colorado. Democrats did underperform further down the ballot, though, losing House seats where they were expected to gain them and floundering in their bid to take control of the Senate, which will remain Republican dominated unless they can pull off an unlikely victory in a pair of special elections in Georgia in January. Some elder statesmen have already reached their conclusions. They blame the party's lackluster performance on policies like defunding the police, the Green New Deal, and Medicare for All, offering scant evidence that these progressive battle cries actually led to a significant electoral backlash. They've stuck by them regardless. Meanwhile, establishment types, including the Lincoln Project's cast of grifters, and we'll have to get into the Lincoln Project, have been eager to take credit for Biden's victory and historic vote share, now shaping up to be the largest since Ronald Reagan's re-election in 1984. In essence, everything good that happened for Democrats in this election, in other words, was the result of Democratic Party business as usual. Everything bad was the left's fault. Rosh, let's talk through this, because isn't this the correct lesson that we should be drawing from this? We've seen here in the UK that left-wing ideas are actually unpopular in the electorate, aren't they? Like Corbyn got absolutely smashed just last December. And maybe, this is the lesson that we should be taking from the US election, which is that Americans hate socialists and they view this kind of deal, the Green New Deal, as socialist and therefore not good. I mean, Trump almost won, didn't he?
So Trump actually lost by, I think, the biggest margin in US electoral history, about 5 million votes between Biden and Trump. And this US election seems to be a repudiation of Trump himself, if not the Republican Party. But in terms of left-wing ideas being unpopular, in the UK at least, there's been some good work on this by organizations like We Own It. Economically, left ideas are broadly popular, even with conservative voters. So ideas around nationalizing key industries like transport, utilities, most people want those to be in public hands. Ideas around increasing the highest top tax rate on high earners, that's also got a lot of public support. So the polling shows that most people are moderate social democrats. And if you can propose a program that will fundamentally change the material conditions for people, make their lives materially better, put some money in their wallets, give them better paying conditions, people are crying out for that because the economy doesn't work for most people. And what the American election has shown us is that in some good data has come out from Justice Democrats, who are an organization who helped get AOC elected and other members of the squad. They've shown that in swing seats, in that Democrats that ran on Medicare for All and the Green New Deal actually won their swing seat elections. And the more established Democrats who didn't talk about those policies didn't win. So what publics in America, in the UK, and in other Western economies are really calling out for is like they want substantial economic change. Like they're looking at the economy and they're saying it's rigged. It doesn't work for most people. So people want substance. They don't want talking points. Biden in this election didn't have much of an economic program. He was running on civility, morality, trying to show that he would be a safer pair of hands compared to Donald Trump. But there wasn't much in economic substance. And you're right. In America in particular, there's a very virulent form of anti-communism, which is kind of a hangover from the Cold War era and the McCarthyism. But the thing is that the right in America use this kind of rhetoric for anyone who has a mildly redistributive program. So they called Obama a communist, and he was far and away anything like a communist. His economic program was fairly neoliberal. He supported massive bank bailouts. So I think blaming the left is a very bad move, because the left have all the ideas, right? The right have nothing to say on economic issues apart from more deregulation, more privatization, more jobs for their buddies. But actually, the ideas that take on the crises that we're facing, the climate crisis, rampant inequality, the left has ideas on these. The right just turns to using cultural grievances, cultural resentment to push against those economic ideas. And unfortunately, they can be really salient. That's why we're seeing social issues become such a polarizing thing here and in the US.
Well, talking about those kinds of views and talking about the polarization here, are things even that bad? Like, I mean, is inequality that bad? Isn't like what's happening to the climate kind of over-reported? Isn't this really, isn't this something that's been sort of concocted by academics and university students and experts who really aren't to be trusted? And when you answer that, can you also tell us what the Green New Deal is? Because it sounds kind of vague.
Okay. Yeah, so things are that bad. I mean, just in the UK, people are in work poverty. Like, most benefit claimants work. Work doesn't work for most people. It's one household income isn't enough to support a family anymore, and we're seeing wage stagnation and massive remuneration for people in the top of organizations. You're seeing this massive increase in income differentials between the people at the top of an organization and the working people in the organization. So yes, things are that bad, and that's repeated all across the Western world. In terms of climate, the science is unequivocal. The science says we've got 10 years to reach net zero if we're going to stand any chance of not reaching 2 degrees more warming, which will set off a whole load of catastrophic feedbacks. So the debate about whether or not it's happening, that's we don't need to be having that debate anymore. The debate should be, how are we going to decarbonize? What our priority is going to be, and that's what the Green New Deal is about. The Green New Deal says it recognizes the urgency of the situation and the radicalism that it demands, and the only way that we're going to reach net zero in time is if we transform our economy. And the only way we're going to transform our economy is if we bring a broad coalition of people on board with that transformation. But, the economy doesn't work for most people. We need to restore the esteem of people who, in this pandemic, were called low skilled, but actually turn out to be incredibly essential. We need to invest in massive renewable rollout and focus on teaching and caring, like jobs that have massive social value. So what the Green New Deal says is that if we transform our economy, we can deal with the climate and we can have a better standard of well-being. We can have a stronger society built on actual social solidarity instead of the competition that we have at the moment. So it's a radical policy that faces up to the problems that we have.
Well, I'm glad we brought in the others here, because this is where I'd like to ask some opinions from across the board, because what I'd like to ask to everyone, and I think I'll start with Stephen and then Rob, is this even realistic? Because this sounds like a big program of investment when we're just going through a pandemic. We've borrowed up the wazoo. We've got no money. Why don't we let the private sector take the lead and innovate and do the things that government isn't good at doing? Government is not good at innovating, right? Like, that's what we're told. So, shouldn't we let the private sector come in and sort that out? And let me start with Stephen. What do you think to that? Like, to the idea of the Green New Deal and how we tackle the crisis?
Yeah, Thomas, I think it's a really good idea. What's interesting is that if you look at the research, if we invest money in green industries, actually, it's the best way to bounce back economies. So I don't really see this sort of thing as something which is, a sort of lefty weird idea. I think if you're a capitalist, you can also look at green industry industries and say, look, if we use that to spend all this money, I think it's something like $10 trillion are going to be spent around the world to reflate and rebuild economies. If they spend it on green industries rather than fracking and all the rest of this stuff, you actually get a lot more employment and a lot more GDP. So I'm all for it. I think even someone with your sort of political views could probably support that.
Okay, well, let's see, Rob, maybe you can win me over and put that nail in the coffin. Do you think government taking money and investing it is the way forward into green technologies, or should we leave that to the private sector?
I have to preface what I say is that the Ferret doesn't do opinion, we just do facts. So we're unlike some of the others here. So but some of the facts we have reported show that the private sector, when it's invited to do things, doesn't do them very well. We've run a series of stories on, the private sector companies that run hostels or homes for asylum seekers in Glasgow, and the stories have tended to indicate that that's been fairly disastrous. I mean, the asylum seekers, particularly in COVID, have been in terrible conditions, and there've been some deaths, unfortunately, which is very tragic. And so, and there were some appalling attempts by the private sector to evict, which we reported, to evict some of the asylum seekers at different stages. So I think, the problem is that the private sector interests, are really all about the bottom line, which is making money for shareholders. And when you're talking about public services, when you're talking about people's health, when you're talking about the environment, when you're talking about things that are really important to us all, they're things that are social goods. So a lot of people would argue they should be government run and not run for profit.
And Natalie, yes. So I'd love to bring you in on this. Surely you can recognise now from the position you're in the House of Lords that really what we need to do is give business a break. We need to cut taxes. We need to make it easier to innovate and get out of the way and let smart entrepreneurs fix this problem, because we can't rely on stuffy experts to sort it all out for us, right?
Well, I think, like Rob, I'm going to go back to some evidence, and I'm going to go to an unlikely source, which is the Financial Times. And one of the nice things about the Financial Times is about once a week, they run a story saying how absolutely disastrous water privatisation has been, and how what that's seen is the companies have, kept pumping sewerage into our rivers and our oceans. They've failed to invest. They've failed to deliver the promised changes. They've charged us more money, cost us about on average £100 a year each per household more because it's privatised, and they've loaded the water companies up with debt while owned by hedge funds who are taking huge amounts of money out and dumping it in tax havens. Now, this is from that well-known radical source, the Financial Times. So I would say that what's very clear is even people who are part of the establishment understand that privatisation is a failed model, which is built on cutting the pay and condition of workers, on reducing the quality of services, and squeezing public money into private hands. But also, I think coming back to the sort of the US election point, I think I went through the experience of being the Green Party leader in 2015 and saw a Labour Party under Ed Miliband that was aiming to get into number 10 by not saying anything that would offend anybody and just hoping the keys would fall into their lap. Now, that essentially is the strategy that Biden followed. And in this occasion, it sort of worked. But what it really failed to do was inspire lots of people to pull back lots of the Trump voters who perhaps had voted for Obama and then shifted to Trump. But because there wasn't the inspiration to drag them back, you didn't see that sort of shift. And, what we've got to do is change to a world where we can't continue as we are. The current system is utterly broken. The status quo is profoundly unstable. So you end up with either a Trump vision, or you end up with a vision that says enough resources in this world for everyone to have a decent life if we share them out fairly, which is essentially the Green New Deal vision. But it's really important, the Green New Deal, all too often that looks like a whole lot of technical stuff. It looks like wind turbines and, solar panels on roofs and, maybe some electric buses. we've got to get across the idea that we're talking about a different kind of society, put the social into this. The Green New Deal has to mean huge numbers of care jobs, so there's enough care provision for everyone who needs it. It has to mean a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay, a universal basic income. So a vision of a Green New Deal that's going to inspire people is about a lot more than just technology. It's about changing our entire society.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a dramatic overhaul. And when we come back to the US elections and we talk about this, and we're going to get some comments from the listeners in a tick, if from the viewers even, the situation the Democrats face themselves in, to get this deal enacted or anything like this deal seems almost impossible. They don't control the Senate. They've lost seats in the House. By 2022, they could be in a real problem because they've got the hangover, the economic hangover and destruction that's come from COVID and Trump's presidency, and they'll be blamed from that. And oil and gas companies are going to be continuing to go bankrupt and shed jobs. So in this scenario, doesn't it maybe make sense to give up on the deal and just try and actually distance yourselves from it until 2022 if you're the Democrats, and then look at it after that point? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think, what's going to happen with the Senate is going to depend on Georgia, and that's a complicated thing we won't find out until January. But I think what we have to do is not run that centrist path, if you like, Hillary Clinton, Ed Miliband path, because that's a failed model. And people know, there've been surveys done over decades asking people, do you think your kids and grandkids will have a better life than you've had? And they're increasingly massively negative. People get that the current system is broken, and saying, oh, we're just going to leave things much as they are and just twiddle with a few knobs on a few dials on a few minor changes in policy, that's not going to work it. People need a vision of a kind of future, and that's a vision, for young climate strikers, but it's also a vision for, I think, of the Tory voting Brexit voter I met in Darlington during the referendum, who, I sat down and said, what can we find to agree on? And we agreed that we didn't want the A&E in the local hospital to close. We agreed that multinational companies should pay their taxes. We agreed that the minimum wage should be a real living wage for all workers. Now, that's someone who's voting for Brexit and voting Tory, yet she hadn't seen that she was being offered an alternative that actually squared with what her views generally were. And that's what's really lacking.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question here, and I'm just going to have to squint to look at it. Biden's neoliberalism will be a field day for the private sector. Both nominees favor the private sector more, and they aren't bothered about green causes. So would you say, Roshan, we'll finish on that comment because I want to move on to the other topics we're covering today. Would you say, Roshan, that's a fair comment, that both of them are neoliberal candidates that favour the private sector, the hero entrepreneur, rather than the public sector? Would that be a fair assessment?
I think that's probably a fair characterisation of Biden, looking at the picks he's choosing for his cabinet previous voting record. But I think the important thing to remember is that the left is stronger than it was 10 years ago, right? So we have powerful social movements that have moved the conversation further towards the urgency of action that we need, the radicalism that we need. That wasn't around in the Obama era, and that kind of action, a social movement action, has led to even Biden changing his position. His climate policy is to inject around $2 trillion into green stimulus, and that wouldn't have happened without social movements, without like the Sunrise movements or climate strikers. So we're in a different position now, and we should leverage that power to ensure that we get the radical.
Okay. Well, I think we lost the sound there just a little bit, but I would like to move on to Rob Edwards' story now, because I think what the Ferret is doing actually ties into this discussion on the Green New Deal and the state of the environment in, to me, a more tangible way. Now, I've still got some questions for you, Rob, but let me just give a brief overview of the article, which will be included in the links in the description, which is a government leak reveals destruction of marine wildlife. Scotland has failed to meet a 10-year-old target to prevent damage to precious marine wildlife, according to a leaked Scottish government report, as seen by the Ferret. The report reveals that priority seabed habitats meant to be protected around the coast have been in decline in 5 large areas since 2011. Seagrass, flame shells, seaweed beds, and tube worm reefs have been destroyed by the fishing industry and pollution, it says. Campaigners warn that these habitats, vital for fish and as a store for carbon, are now perilously close to being wiped out after a decade of decline. They accuse ministers of breaking promises made a decade ago to prevent the marine environment from being harmed. Now, Rob, before we get into the substance of the report itself and the leaked report, I just wanted to ask you about the purpose of the Ferret itself, because in a world where there's so much rapid fire news that's available on platforms like Twitter, you know, investigations like these that come out so occasionally in these reports, you know, what place does the Ferret have in that kind of landscape, that fast-paced information landscape?
Well, the trouble, of course, with fast-paced, Twitter-based social media news is that it's sometimes wrong. I mean, we've all know examples of that. We run a fact-checking service that attempts to call out particularly egregious inaccuracies that are widely shared on social media. And I think, and you know, one of the founding ideas of the Ferret 5 years ago was that we need reliable, fact-based investigative journalism to hold power to account. I mean, you know, that may sound a bit trite, but it's really, to me anyway, it's really, really important. And that's why we believe in, you know, as transparently, as openly, straightforwardly, and honestly as possible, investigating matters of public interest, such as, you know, the state of marine wildlife, or, as I mentioned earlier, the plight of asylum seekers in Glasgow, and lots of other things, and you know, finding out the truth about them, exposing the reality of them, using sources that everyone can understand and see and judge for themselves, in order that, you know, big companies, big governments, big institutions, anyone with power and money can't get away with doing things that might be questionable without being held to account. And, you know, you can only do that by investing money in investigative journalism. And investigative journalism, as I'm sure you know, is very expensive and can be very time consuming and brings with it lots of legal risks. So you've got to cover all those things. But, you know, our fundamental belief is that any democracy, particularly a small and relatively young, in terms of the Scottish Parliament democracy, that in Scotland, needs to have a free and fair media that hold it to account. And, you know, unfortunately, the mainstream media has been deteriorating and weakening. I mean, there's still some very good examples of it, but it's much weaker than it used to be. So we're trying to find a new way that we hope is sustainable and more democratic and more open, and, you know, and not beholden to any foreign corporation. And that's why, you know, we do things in the way we do things.
Well, talking of the way you do things, and again, I will come to the report in a tick, but it's fair to say that you're a multi-stakeholder cooperative. You're cooperative, so your readers are co-owners of the work that you do. And as you say, that's extraordinarily, well, you know, investigative journalism is very expensive. You know, it's extraordinarily so. And you know, most, I think, national newspapers, certainly in England, have jettisoned their investigative departments. You know, I think there's only one left that's permanent, that have permanent staff. But in searching for a new financial model and making people co-owners, is this not a case of like too many cooks will spoil the broth? Because surely you need to have a clear captain, you know, like Rupert Murdoch, like the Barclay brothers, you know, an owner with a direction that represents a voice, a clear and consistent voice, instead of a model of different people who are co-owners.
I know you're playing devil's advocate, but really that was ludicrous. I mean, the answer is no to that. We took a deliberate decision to make a cooperative model because we believed it was the right one. So instead of having an owner that dictates a media policy, or indeed an editor, a single person, we take decisions collectively. Now, you know, I'm not going to pretend that's always easy, or it's always simple, or that we always agree about everything. Of course we don't. But because there are now tools available, particularly online messaging services, we can, as long as we're online, take decisions by chatting to each other on these messaging services very quickly. And we've done that in the past. So when a story breaks, or we learn something, or someone tells us something, we need to act very quickly, we can do that. And we can do it collectively, because we don't all have to go to a room and meet. We can all talk to each other on WhatsApp, or talk to each other on Slack or whatever, and make decisions that way. So I don't think it inhibits our ability for nimble, flexible, and when necessary, fast decision making. But it also goes deeper than that. I mean, I think because any editorial decision that the Ferret takes, what to investigate, about which we always ask our readers. We've asked our readers every few months what we should investigate, and done what they tell us, and we're still doing that. So they asked us to investigate land ownership, for example, and we're in the middle of an investigation about that. But any decision we take about exactly what we look at, how we run a story, how a story is worded, who we go to for comment, etc., are decisions that are taken very largely collectively. And any story before it's published has to be seen by another two people other than the author. So there's an overall oversight. And I would argue, and I'd argue very strongly, that means that the decisions we make are much better than they otherwise would be, and better than decisions that might have been taken by an individual. Now, that doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, of course we do, but it does mean we make fewer mistakes, and we're more likely to be, when we're chatting about stories and taking decisions and sounding on different views, we're much more likely to make the right decisions about stories. And that's really important, because when you're doing the kind of work we do, you are vulnerable to being sued by people with lots of money, and we've certainly had that, and being able to jointly agree how to approach a subject, what to say, and how to fairly represent what we understand to be the reality of whatever we're reporting, means we're much stronger and better together, if I could use in Scotland a very unfortunate historical thing. But so working together as a cooperative doesn't inhibit our nimble decision making, I would argue, because of new technology, and it means that our decisions are much better. And we're trying to prove and show to people that newspapers don't need to be little dictatorships. But the traditional model is an editor just goes around swearing at everybody, and certainly that has happened in newspapers. But we like to think that we're different from that, and we also like to think that if readers raise anything with us, we take it very seriously, and if they suggest we should do something or do something different, we try and respond constructively.
Well, talking about little dictators, a right-wing politician former Prime Minister in Australia, banned Rupert Murdoch this week for being probably the biggest proponent of climate change denial and sort of enemy of the global environment, really, in the world, and charged that his reporters and editors did exactly what he said, even though in private they tell politicians and other people they don't believe what they're saying.
Although apparently, if his son doesn't agree with him, or one of his sons doesn't agree with him.
Yeah, his son's come out and left the organisation precisely for that. So in an era where we have that kind of thing going on, it is important to discuss a reader sort of led model rather than maybe a dictator led model. And as much as I've been playing devil's advocate, I wholeheartedly support it. Now, let me take the tone of Rupert Murdoch again, though, when it comes to this report on marine life, which is, one of the places in the world that's probably going to be most protected from the ravages of climate change, may even benefit from climate change, is going to be Scotland, surely. I mean, what's the point in protecting marine life when it's businesses? Marine life doesn't feed people, businesses feed people, isn't it? Businesses that have had to expand, like fishing organizations, fishing companies, aren't their livelihoods more important than these sort of habitats?
Well, there's so many things wrong with that. It would take me kind of half an hour to unpick it all. I think the important thing is that marine life, wildlife, it has a value of its own. It has an inherent value. It's very beautiful. If you look at we ran a video with that story taken by a diver, which showed these little flame shells, which are apparently very wee things. It looked like little shellfish with these very bright orange tentacles going across and it looked stunning. And of course, most people don't get to see that. You have to go deep in the sea and so forth. Yeah, that's a flame shell. There is a video of it of it moving on our story. But but it's not just that they're inherently beautiful. I mean, without wanting to sound too much like a kind of eco hippie, we are all connected, right? I mean, everything is all connected. So the sea, what happens in the sea affects us, and so forth. And a lot of these environments that we were talking about, that this leaked government report showed were suffering, are the flame shell beds, what are called tube worm beds or serpulid beds, or male beds made out of this kind of hardened coral-like seaweed. They are nurseries for fish, right? And if the fishing industry needs fish to fish for us to eat, so unless you have a healthy marine environment, the fish don't breed and they suffer, and so there's less for us to eat. I mean, it's an obvious point, but these things are all connected, and it's not it is easy to say, what's the point of protecting mollusks at the bottom of the sea? The point of protecting mollusks at the bottom of the sea is that everything that happens to wildlife, whether it's in the sea or on land or wherever, is affects us ultimately, and we're part of some big system. And if we ignore or trash the natural environment around us, we will all end up suffering. I mean, climate change, of course, being the prime example of that.
Well, on that point, I just wanted to get maybe your views on it. I'd like to start with Natalie, which is if this is such a big problem, what is it that people can do about it? It seems quite remote to us.
Well, I think one of the things is that we often see people saying, oh, people should change their lifestyle, but it's actually so terribly difficult for people to live in ways that don't tread too heavily on the planet, because, it's no point in saying to people, oh, don't drive your car and take a bus if you live in a village where there are no bus services. There's no point in saying to people, I did a little test in Sheffield. I went into Lidl and looked at the vegetables wrapped in plastic versus the loose vegetables, and the loose vegetables were roughly twice as expensive as the ones wrapped in plastic. So I would say to people, don't focus on how you live as an individual. We need system change. System change, not climate change, is the saying. And so, rather than focusing on your individual behaviour, get together with others, campaign for change, to do things differently, campaign to restore a local bus service, campaign to support a local community farm, get some land. We were talking about land ownership there from the Ferret, and I'm really pleased to hear that the Ferret's doing that, because it's such a huge issue in the UK with our concentration of land ownership. And the point you raised, Thomas, about the isn't it all about the economy? Well, the economy is a complete subset of the environment. There are no jobs on a dead planet is a very simple saying, but it's one that needs to be said again and again and again.
My mic is muted, apologies. Stephen, I'd like to bring you in here as a fellow editor, and I'll bring you in, Roche, as well. And journalists, which is just on the value of the work itself. This is something that we don't see the elite, the establishment media covering too much. Is there value in this kind of work, and is it the kind of thing that you look at doing as well with Byline?
No, I think it's a really good work, and completely agree with Robert the Ferret. I mean, I think that what really concerns us is the decline in investigative journalism, and that's very important for Byline as well. But also the decline in local investigative journalism, which is even worse. And I think that these types of studies of specific areas are just not happening. And it's not just the environment. We're not seeing investigative reporting about the NHS or planning or it's just disappearing. It's sort of hollowed out. You probably know, I think it was in 2015 that something like I think it's about £1.5 billion just got sucked out of newspapers by Google from advertising. And it just means that nobody can afford it. It's a bit like the music industry. They sort of say, the accountants come in and they say, look, we don't need any of these new bands. This A&R stuff's very expensive. So you keep the Rolling Stones just, going around and touring until they sort of drop and die. It's a bit like that with investigative journalism. The first thing that happened when Murdoch came in and everyone looked at newspapers was they said, look, this bit that's really expensive. And as Rob says, the bit that tends to get us in all these problems with lawyers and things is investigative journalism. Why don't we just get loads of celebrity columnists instead? They get a lot more people reading and they make people happy. And so I think that this, is absolutely essential. And I think when you start looking at green issues, I completely agree with Natalie, it's systemic issues we're talking about. People have to get together, and I think it's Extinction Rebellion that have this 3.5% idea. Once you've got a body of people who can start making political change, things are going to change. And we've got to get people really sort of motivated and angry enough about all these things. And I think the stuff that Rob's doing, does make you angry because you suddenly realise what's being lost. Thousands and thousands of types of animals and plants are getting extinct every day. So it's really, really important we do this.
Brilliant. I'm going to bring in Rosh here for a final thought, and and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said already. You were asking about the value of the natural world. Like the natural world has been a source of awe and inspiration since the start of humanity, and it has such a great benefit to people's mental health to be able to be out in nature, to have access to nature. It's a fundamental right for people. It should be. And also, in terms of dealing with climate, ecosystem restoration is low-hanging fruit. If we can restore, protect, and expand ecosystems, we can store carbon in carbon sinks. Like in this country, for example, it's not very sexy, but peatland. There's loads of peatland, and it's a massive store of carbon. So we need to protect these places and restore these places.
Brilliant. That's a really important thing as well. And again, that ties into the discussion over land ownership and so forth and the investigations. Natalie, you've got a final thought there.
Well, just one final thought is people don't realise that Britain is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We rank somewhere around about 180th in terms of our loss of nature. That's the State of Nature report, which is put out by a big group of NGOs every couple of years. And so what we see now is a pale shadow of what Britain used to be, of what our land used to be. The fenlands, which are now like deserts of industrial agriculture, used to be a few hundred years ago like the Amazon in terms of their richness. And so we have to understand how much we've lost and how much we need to restore as a foundation for our future well-being, our future lives.
Excellent. That's a really interesting point. And just on a personal point, as people point out to me that the Peak District near where I live shouldn't be as bald as it is. The fact that it has no trees is what is increasing flash floods and so forth as well. And so sometimes I feel like when we're talking about 2% and so forth, this seems quite a distant thing. But if we can talk about our local environment, the environment that we recognize, and increasing that diversity and the beauty of the nature around us, but also that creates both economic value, but just value to us as human beings, I think there's definitely a winner there. And this is why I'd really like to celebrate the Ferret's work. And whether you're Scottish or not, I suggest you become a member and check them out. Now, I was going to move on to Stephen's work, but I'm going to save that juicy bit for the end. And it is an absolute beauty because I recognize that Natalie has some places to be. And I want to let her get away by 6 o'clock. So, Natalie, I'm going to talk about the Internal Markets Bill because that is a sexy title for a sexy subject. This is what everyone wants to chat about. I'll do your little intro and then you can tell us a bit about it more. So again, the link is in the description. Lords rebuke for the government over Internal Markets Bill. The House of Lords, led by former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, removed a whole chunk of government legislation in the form of Part 5 of the Internal Market Bill. That's the part in which the government is seeking to break international law, although they hasten to assure us, only in a specific and limited way, as anyone who ever breaks laws is interested in doing. You have to be right up with the detailed, arcane procedures of the House of Lords to understand just how unusual doing this is, particularly at committee stage. Take my word for it, for the leader of the crossbench non-party peers in the Lords to be doing this is a very big thing. And so was the vote. 433 to 165, with 44 Tory peers rebelling to vote against the government. What is this all about, Natalie? And why? What is this historic vote on?
Well, I think if we say something that we think of as fundamental to our society, fundamental to the way we think about the world, we think we need the rule of law. Everyone needs to know what the rules are, what the laws are, and what the punishments are if you break them. But what we have is a situation here where the government is saying, well, we signed the withdrawal agreement just a few months ago, the start of this year, in January. That was what finalised Brexit. And now they're saying, well, we're putting this clause into the bill that would actually break the law. Now, this has got lots of the lawyers' exercise, but it's also crucially important because what it really shows is the way our government is indeed a far right, very much a Trumpian, is now the most Trumpian government in the world, in terms of it saying, well, the law is going to be whatever we say it's going to be. We're just going to, there's been a lot of focus on the lack of democracy, the way in which the government has been passing trying to pass lots of framework bills where it says, well, we'll just say we'll do these things. Like, we tell you we'll keep the chlorinated chicken out from America because we've got good intentions. So we don't have to write this into the law. We'll just tell you we're going to do it. We don't trust the government. Most people don't trust the government. The government has shown itself not to be trustworthy. And, this is really crucial, both in terms of those principles of the rule of law and government obeying its own laws. But it's also crucial in terms of this is foundational for the Northern Ireland peace agreement. Without that, we're in a very, very bad place. So this is the government both flailing around, but also very deliberately breaking down our systems, breaking down the rule of law, trying to, say that, it's related to the Dominic Cummings, well, I can go and test my eyesight with a drive up and down the country because the rules don't apply to me. And this is, part of the same thing. But what we're also doing this to is the whole international community. And this is going to really, going back to where we started in terms of the US election result. Joe Biden has Irish heritage. He's very interested in the Good Friday Agreement. And this is really threatens to make Britain an international pariah, and that reflects the degree in which the House of Lords has reacted to it.
Well, I'm going to come back to the Good Friday Agreement because this does get bandied around a lot by mainland politicians and people who are interested with maybe not as much knowledge as we'd like. So it's definitely something we'd like to dive into. But firstly, when you talk about the lack of trust in the government, I mean, the government's still riding high in the opinion polls, despite having to deal with an absolutely appalling crisis. You say the government are kind of clueless. It says so in the article, but most governments have done badly in the coronavirus. Even Germany's struggling. So haven't they actually been looking after the economy and the health of the nation as best they can? And shouldn't they be trusted to do what they set out to do, which is to get Brexit done? This is what they were voted in with, a huge mandate to do, specifically to do this. Shouldn't we just give them the tools and get out of the way?
Well, I first of all want to tackle the term huge mandate in there, because in the election in 2019, 44% of the people who voted Conservative. We have Boris Johnson with 100% of the power in the House of Commons because we have a undemocratic system. The UK is not a democracy, and so there's not very strong support for the government. It's one of the reasons why I say the House of Lords is now actually more representative of the people, with those crossbenchers who we've just saw holding the balance of power, the non-party people. That reflects the views of the British public far more than the House of Commons does. But in terms of the handling of the pandemic, I think yes, it's difficult, and some of the mistakes the government made early on, I'm fully prepared to acknowledge. I don't think we had a full understanding of the degree of aerosol and transmission that come from closed rooms and air conditioning. There was more focus on the transmission by hands and hand washing without the focus there should have been on the broader issues. Now, some of those things were unavoidable and no one could avoid them. But the fact that we have a disastrously bad test and trace privatized system that's pumped huge amounts of money into private hands for absolutely dreadful results. If you contrast how our test and trace is working versus compared to look at some of the stories out of Australia and see how they can particularly, actually see in Victoria, you actually read the story and they're almost tracing the virus as it walks down the street. They know where everyone went. They know where people had contact with. They've set up systems that worked, and they're systems that are based on local knowledge, the kind of things that people were telling the government right from the start we should be doing. Then, of course, you look at all of those contracts for personal protective equipment, PPE, that have basically gone to mates of the government, companies with no track record, no history. You even look at what happened with ventilators. Now, it's turned out that the doctors tell us now we don't need ventilators, as many ventilators as we thought. Different kind of treatments are being used. Now, that's unavoidable. But what happened was the government, rather than going to existing ventilator suppliers and saying, where can we get them from? They started this, we're going to have private enterprise, we're going to have innovation. And so they got a whole lot of companies who make things like, car muffler parts, and said, can you make a ventilator? And that worked out very, very badly. And all of those are predictable things. And so, the virus is very difficult to manage, but the government has objectively, when you look at what they've spent money on, how they've spent money, as well as the outcomes, has been absolutely disastrous.
Well, I have to come back to Brexit though, because again, it seems to me, whether we like it or not, we have an elected House of Commons that has an overwhelming majority. This is how the system works, on the basis of seemingly a Brexit election. And that government was given a mandate to get Brexit done. I mean, that's literally their tagline. They didn't have any other policies that anyone could remember. That's just get Brexit done. And that's what people want to see happen. Now, what right does the House of Lords, really an unelected chamber, have to get in the way of the government doing what they were put there to do by the people? And I'd like to bring in everyone else on this as well as yourself, because obviously you sit in the House of Lords and this could seem like an attack, but I know that's maybe not where you wanted to be. So I'll first off, stick up your hand, any of the guests, if you want to come in on that, but I'll let Natalie answer that a little bit further now, and then I'll bring in any of our guests.
Okay, well, how the government was trying to get Brexit done was they signed the withdrawal agreement with the EU in January. And what they're doing now is disavowing that and turning it around. And we are going to, goodness help us, end the Brexit transition period on the 31st of December. I don't think there's any way that can now be stopped. I think personally the most likely way that's going to happen is we're going to crash out. And if you listen to, the road hauliers, you listen to the supermarkets, it's going to be a very chaotic situation. But, even if we do get a deal, it's going to be such a skeleton deal. There's a huge amount unsettled, uncertain. But what we're saying with the House of Lords is saying, you signed this deal in January after the election, delivering what, however undemocratic our system is, what was voted for in that election, to then turn around and say, oops, well, we made a mistake and we're just going to, annoy the whole international community and threaten the Northern Ireland peace process. But by turning around on this, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, we are back, and you mentioned it, I'll just very briefly do, the whole Northern Ireland issue. The EU wants to protect its food standards, its workers' rights standards, and so it needs to keep out products that are made not to those standards. That means you either have a hard border between Ireland or Northern Ireland, or you have a hard border down the middle of the Irish Sea. This is the innate problem of Brexit, which there's never been a solution to, and which the government has been trying to fudge. And, the fudge has been exposed by the current situation.
I'm going to bring in Stephen, and I'm going to bring him a little bit yourself. It's difficult. The Irish issue is it's about an area of the world that probably neither the British nor the Irish fully want to take responsibility for. And as such, it seems that with the demographic change and with the increase in representation of the nationalists to almost exactly the same level as the unionists, that maybe there's time for people to be talking about referenda on Irish unification. And maybe that's something that's not being talked about. But, what I'd like to hear, Stephen, is your thoughts on this internal markets bill and whether the government are right to be asking what they're doing or whether the Lords should be pushing back against these lowering of our standards. Oh, and we'll have to unmute you. There we go. Oh, yeah, there we go. Oh, sorry, bear with us 2 ticks. Okay, Stephen, we're having trouble unmuting your mic. So when it is unmuted, we'll get you in. So, okay. Oh, there we go. We've got you. Or not. No, okay. Tricky internet connection at his end. Well, the Irish question then is a difficult one. It's probably one that deserves a full show and a full and rounded discussion. It does get batted around during the Brexit discussions, but what else outside of the Good Friday Agreement is at stake with this particular clause outside of the North of Ireland?
Well, I think if you're coming back to me, I mean, just the other issue is, hugely for people in Northern Ireland, and this, of course, we can't forget, is one of the poorest areas of the UK with very low wage levels, is, of course, at the moment, huge amounts of supplies, basic things you'd find in supermarkets, tins of baked beans get thrown around a lot. Many of those come from Great Britain and go to Northern Ireland. And the issue is going to be whether it's possible to get them through, how much extra, financial burdens will go on suppliers, which will then go into people, into people's shopping baskets, and people will have to pay. But there's also, of course, huge issues across the border. I mean, I can remember just very early after the Brexit vote, talking to a Green councillor from the Irish side of the border, and they had the 2 local councils on each side of the border had shared children's services. So they had the same members of staff who crossed over and worked together. They're having to disentangle things like that. There's, of course, famously the cows who graze on one side of the border and get milked on the other side of the border. And when that is a border between the European Union and non-European Union, there's huge technical problems, many of which the government has just really failed to engage with and failed to solve. And we are now talking, was it 50 days? It's something like 50 days to when these things have to be solved. And the hauliers are saying, they were supposed to be putting out now a handbook for hauliers explaining what they'd need to do at the borders. And they said, oh, it's been delayed and it's coming next month. And you just have to keep saying this is no way to run a country. Okay,
well, on that final point then, and then I will we'll move on to Stephen's work, actually, because I know Brexit's a difficult one for people to involve themselves in, and you are on the front line talking about it now, so it's best to pick your brains specifically. Is with Brexit and with this internal markets bill, is there anything that people can do about it or should engage in? Where should they look to both find out more and do things about it?
Well, what I would say is I'm aware that it doesn't sound very sexy. It all sounds very complicated, but it's not very hard to say. Write to your MP, whoever they are, and say, because I'm not by any means certain that how firm Labour is going to hold on these issues. So whoever your MP is, write to them and say, I believe that Britain should follow international law. That's quite simple and clear. The other thing to say, which is really important, is another crucial aspect of this bill, which under normal conditions would be a huge issue, is this bill is totally overruling devolved administrations on rights of things like to set things that are part of their competencies, that are part of their rules. So Wales is bringing in bans on 9 single-use plastic items. The Internal Markets Bill takes away the right from them to keep that ban, and it places it instead the very, very weak England ban that only bans 3 things. So this is a bill that's riding roughshod over our current constitution, riding roughshod over international law. So what can you do is, I would say, write to your MP, and you don't have to engage with all the details and get really in, but say, hey, I've heard about this and I'm really concerned about this, and I want to make sure that we don't do the wrong thing with this, that we have to stick to international law and we have to respect the rights of the devolved administrations.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Now, we've got this excellent report from Stephen Colgrave from Byline Times, and I'm going to give it a little intro before questioning the man himself on this, and hopefully we have everything going well with the mics and so forth with that. So the title of the piece, and I love the title because I think it talks a lot about how our society generally looks at, or certainly our government looks at, how to manage a country, which is who needs a civil service when there are perfectly good management consultants. Of course, the article writes, management consultants have been helping governments for decades, but this government is using them not just to do what the civil service can't do, but to effectively outsource the role of the civil service itself, leaving a demoralized rump operating as a toothless service with no real role. This appeared to be confirmed by a £180 million consultancy contract discovered by Byline Times last month. This is a split between 6 of the world's largest consultancy firms: McKinsey, Bain, KPMG, Accenture, Deloitte, and PwC, with an option to extend the contract for another year for a further £180 million. So, Stephen, what's the problem with this? The civil service is a large... a bloated bureaucracy that no one likes. Isn't it good that the private sector comes in and speeds it all up? I mean, it trims the fat. Don't you need the expertise of management consultants to help you do this?
Well, I think the problem is it's sort of picking up on the point we were making before, that there are really important things in civil society. One is the rule of law, which we've just talked about the problems there. We have a government that doesn't want to believe in the rule of law. We had proroguing Parliament, and that got taken to the Supreme Court, and then that got thrown out. But we saw that this government sort of try and get the Queen on side to sign that piece of paper, which was put her in an invidious position. We've also seen newspapers being briefed to actually start denigrating the judiciary. In the same way, civil service is the next thing the government wants to really unpick. And the civil service is really important because its independence actually guarantees the independence of the country. So, we know one of the differences between the States and the UK is that, very much of the administration we would call the civil service is politicised and actually changes when government changes. So, we've already started to see this happen because we saw sort of permanent secretaries left. We saw the Home Office permanent secretary cross swords with Patel and then disappear. We've seen SPAD, special political advisors, coming in. I mean, Cummings is probably the sort of the ultimate version of that, but there are Cummings, with his wonderful weird people he wanted to recruit, has a whole army of special advisors who are actually sitting in between ministers and often civil servants. And now, the way to actually get rid of the rest of the civil service is really to outsource them to management consultants. And the reason why we were so worried when we actually saw this piece come up, this 180 million, this procurement, was that it was for stuff that civil service can do. It was actually for project management for the final stages of Brexit. Now, that sort of project management is sort of neat to good civil servants and could easily be done. So we saw it very much as a procurement, which was actually saying, this could easily be done by the civil service, but we're going to give you 180 million new top 6 management consultancy firms. Really, it's a bit like the fact the government gave 38 million, as out to advertising to its to all the mainstream national media because it wanted to keep them on side. This to me really smacks of a procurement and says, oh, let's give everyone 30 million quid, the top 6 consultancies, keep them on side and make sure that they'll do our dirty work for us. So that's why I'm incredibly concerned about what's going on.
Yeah. So the article.
I mean, to be honest, Thomas, it's sorry, the button game, but yeah. It's the same. You probably know Byline Times. We really spearheaded the whole thing against PPE and these scandals and all the rest of it. I think it's the same endemic problem we've got with this government. They're ruling by emergency powers. There's actually no end in sight to these emergency powers. They're giving sort of procurements to either really dodgy companies or their mates, or they're giving them to big management consultancies. And to be honest, a lot of them are probably going to end up with jobs at these management consultancies once they've been turfed out because the red wall disappears. So it's so blatant. It's really so blatant that it's almost scary.
Well, this is actually something that you outlined though in the article, which is it's not you mentioned the emergency powers right here, but in the article you trace this back to Blair. Blair's era is really the rise of the management consultants, just as the private sector was saying, actually, management consultants aren't worth the money. They keep gouging us. There's the Enron scandal and so forth. They overcharge and underdeliver. We don't really need them. That's what the private sector's saying. But the government, they hadn't even considered as customers. And Blair's like, here you go, lots of fat contracts. So isn't there really cross-party support on this idea?
I know it's like to pick on Blair on this. I don't think it was really Blair. I think it's the first bit you were talking about. 2008, there was a banking crisis. Was Enron, what was that, 2000, 2001? In fact, McKinsey's did a study, I think, a few years ago that 70% of the transformations that were being worked on by management consultants in this country weren't working. And really what had happened was the 90s was a great period, probably the 80s for McKinsey's, 90s for management consultancy generally, because you had all these, it's really the growth of MBAs, and you had all these MBA students had to go and do something, so they went to management consultancies. What happened in 2008 is you had a banking crisis, and you already had a private sector that had fallen out of love with management consultancy. The banking crisis just sort of at that point, just completely put the private sector out of business. Really, they couldn't afford management consultancy anymore. And so the management consultants looked for another market. They were very sensible, really. They already had been doing public sector stuff, but as they saw private sector disappear, they just knew they had to develop this new market, which was the public sector. And that's from 2008, you can really trace the really big practices, as they call them, the public sector practices within management consultants. And also a lot of financial, a lot of audit companies sort of set up consultancy as well. And so I would say, in a way, Blair was the client, that's right, but it was the management consultancies that sort of found and encouraged the new market.
Right. But isn't it a kind of common sense thing to do? I mean, in a world where I think a lot of people look at the civil service, they look at, I don't know, shows like The Thick of It or even Yes Minister, and they don't really know what it does. And they think, well, why don't we get private sector experts in?
Well, first thing is that actually the people that you actually laugh at in The Thick of It are actually the special political advisors, the SPADs, not the civil servants. So they're usually the ministers, who are usually incredibly stupid. And then there are the devious people, who are the SPADs. And usually the people who are actually trying to do a good job are actually the civil servants. So, I'm not sure that one really holds, Thomas, really. But, that's not necessarily the evidence we should take, I suppose, really. But, I think, the issue is, there's a very fundamental issue here. Civil servants work for us. They work for us, the public, and they deal with our money, taxpayers' money and public money. And, actually, I should have added it into my sort of roll call of things I'd done before, but I have actually run a management consultancy in healthcare, and I have worked for government, and I have actually subcontracted to all these big consultants, so I know them inside out. And the fact is, the civil service works for people. They husband public money. And they also work to ministers as well. But you see, there's a difference. Management consultants don't work for the people. They just work for the people who pay them. And they work for their next contract. And they really want to develop their next contract and make it even bigger. So it comes down to me fundamentally, ethically, if you like, who is trying to do what and who is actually serving who. And I think that, if you start to outsource a civil service, you outsource a really important part of civil society. That's sort of really what I'm trying to get to with that article.
Well, I'm going to bring in actually Rob here from the Ferret and ask about some of the work that you've done, and whether, when you're doing investigations of some of the facts you've found, what you found about the role of the private sector and the public sector, and what you found about, maybe, I don't know whether you've looked into management consultancies or anything like that in Scotland. Have you found anything that suggests that they're more interested in really their own profit than the public good?
Yes, I mean, that was very interesting hearing Stephen talk about his work, which is important, and of course makes us think of more things we should do. I mean, we've done quite a lot of investigations into the use of public-private partnerships to build, hospitals and schools, and it turns out quite a lot of the money ends up, in tax havens, and that's problematic. We've certainly, and people generally think, or perhaps there's a perception south of the border that everything's better in Scotland, and the Scottish government is more open and more transparent, and less likely to do the kind of things that the Johnson government does. And obviously, there's a lot of people argue that there's certainly some truth in that, but it's not immune from using management consultants, having close relationships with business, and having the whole kind of revolving door thing. We've done a series of stories about the fish farming industry, for example, where there's one classic example where the woman who was responsible for regulating the fish farming industry for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency got a job for the main industry body working, against regulation. So there's lots of, and there's other examples of that. And we've certainly looked at, the Scottish government does have the Scottish Parliament has a lobbying register, which has its flaws, but we've done a few analyses of the lobbying register which show that, most people that do the lobbying are big business, and maybe the sort of NGOs or trade unions are have much less influence. So I think there's a lot more work to be done on that, and listening to Stephen there has given me some thoughts about how we could do that, which is good. And it's certainly important that there are journalists like the Ferret and like others asking questions about these things. Civil service, we've talked a lot about them. Of course, they're not perfect, and of course, some of them are like Yes Minister, which I'm old enough to remember. And of course, there are the different issues with the SPADs, which we have in Scotland too, which Stephen talked about. But generally speaking, the civil servant instinct is to try and make life easy for themselves and not do things. And although there are good civil servants who take an opposite view, whereas the private sector sort of interest is, as Stephen said, is the bottom line and to do what their clients say. And so I think it's really important to keep a very beady eye on these public-private interactions and what companies government are listening to, what management consultants is employing. And thanks to Stephen, I think we'll do some more digging into that.
Okay, I'm looking forward to those reports. I want to bring up one last bit from the story, and then
just on that. Sorry, just quickly on that point. Rob, if you ever want to work with us on something like that, it'd be very interesting. We actually do have a whistleblower at the moment from a management consultancy, and what's really interesting is that the government contracts have got, with these big six, have got nothing in terms of actually checking their performance. So there's absolutely no penalties at all, and there's actually no oversight on their performance. So we've got a lot of detail on that. It might be interesting to have a chat about that sometime.
Yeah, anything that relates to Scotland, we're going to be interested in.
Brilliant. Well, News Club, where the magic happens. This is it. This is where it's all going to come together. We'll slowly but surely change the world together, as with the audience. But not to keep the audience here too long, I just want to bring up this last bit from the article and then get your concluding thoughts about both what this piece brings up, which is a discussion about the revolving door, and about what the audience can take away from today and what they should maybe be looking to do if immediately they get off and they're like, I need to do something. So we'll get those concluding thoughts after this little bit here. So let me discuss this. So in the last decade, the relationship between government and the biggest management consultancies has become ever more entwined across all departments. Senior figures have moved from one across to the other. For instance, Ben Gummer, who followed Maud as a cabinet office minister, is now a senior advisor at McKinsey, while former junior health minister Stephen Dorrell is now an advisor for KPMG. Even Baroness Dido Harding previously worked for McKinsey, a company which has been paid £565,000 for 6 weeks' work, defining the vision, purpose and narrative for the body replacing Public Health England, the National Institute for Health Protection, to be chaired by former jockey Harding herself. Nice work if you can get it. And you can't get it if you try. You need to get it if you were born to the right people, as far as I can tell. Anyways, guys, I'm going to start off with Roche because we haven't heard from you for a little minute. What do you think the problem is with the revolving door that this report brings out? And do you see stuff about the management consultancy and private sector in the work that you do that's problematic? And what should the audience do about it?
I don't know much about the management consultancy, but I think in terms where this is most poisonous is in terms of media. So you remember in 2017, the head of politics BBC, Robbie Gibb, left the BBC to become Theresa May's director of communications. The same happened with the current director of communications for the Johnson government, Allegra Stratton. She was head of politics at Newsnight. It's a revolving door from the BBC, which has the biggest media share in this country in TV and radio. And people are moving from the highest echelons of the BBC into the Conservative government. And it kind of smacks of corruption, really. The UK government's justified regime change for less than this. But I think it's worrying in that these people are setting the public conversation, and the public conversation is being set by our main media provider, and then they're getting jobs in government. So, I mean, that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
That is a revolving door too far, maybe. So let me do the plug for you, Roche. Everyone should check out the Green New Deal UK website. The link will be in the description, or you can just use a search engine. Maybe use Ecosia, which helps plant trees for every search you do. It's an excellent organisation that's only growing, that's going to be pushing for investment in people and the planet, and to build back better, in the words of the Conservatives. How about yourself, Rob? Any final thoughts on the revolving door and what people should do to get involved with the Ferret or anything else?
Anything else? My supper's on my mind, if I'm honest. But let's part right. I'm
sure it is for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm going to encourage people to subscribe to the Ferret. One of the interesting things we did recently, we surveyed before our last AGM members, and one of the interesting things we discovered was that a very high proportion, I forget the exact numbers, but a very high proportion of people who read a Ferret story went on to take action by signing a petition, by writing to a politician, or had changed their view about something. So I think we were really encouraged by that, that, you know, people who read stories that tell them things they didn't know do go on to take action as a result of them, in however they decide. And that's why, you know, the new media of which we're all part is really important, and why it's really important. It's sustainable, and it grows. And it's also, you know, referring back to what Steve was saying earlier, it's also important that we find ways of working together. And, you know, we're very open to partnerships, although we always have to look to our Scottish readership, you know, and you know, endorse what Rosh said. I mean, obviously, these kind of revolving doors between the media, mainstream media, and government and elsewhere are. Scotland, again, is not immune to them, and I could give you a number of examples. I won't do now, but I'll give you other examples of, you know, where people who work for media organisations have ended up working for industry or working for government, which does raise questions. One of the kind of underlying features there, of course, is that mainstream media is so disintegrating. It's such a poor shadow of what it used to be. Certainly, the newspapers in Scotland are a poor shadow of what they used to be. But, you know, any good journalists, it's very difficult for them to find a good job in a mainstream media newspaper these days is much harder. I mean, there's still some good ones left, but it's much harder. And so they end up doing PR, and that's, to me anyway, that's deeply sad.
Yes, and that's what we're here at the Media Fund. And wait for the plug at the end of the show, but we're going to let Stephen take you home before I give you all the juicy updates.
I think revolving door is interesting because, you know, our thing at Byline is really we investigate and reveal truth about the government and the establishment. And I think the revolving door is all part of this very small, narrow establishment we have in this country. And I think it's the same probably in Scotland as here. There's a very small number of people, a lot of people going to dinner parties and sort of swapping jobs and all the rest of it. And so I think only the new media is prepared to do this. The fact that we've been having long-running investigations like PPE that BBC just hasn't taken up or anyone else. Navis Ahmed, we're really finding massive sort of connections between Trump and Johnson's government, between Russia and Johnson's government. To our end, the government we're facing here, our national government, is the rump of Trumpocracy. And I think only the new media is calling this out. And like the Ferret, we rely on subscribers. We don't have a billionaire funder. And I just think that it's really exciting because I think that next year is going to be a big year for new media. I think we're all beginning to break through, and I think that people are beginning to find out the main media and starting to move our way. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, I'm going to give myself a one shot to take us home and say goodbye to the audience. So I thought this was great. This was a fair show. We are going to tighten it up. We're going to make it even better going forward. We will bring it under an hour. We'll only cover 3 stories. Don't you worry about that. We'll get it excellent just for you guys. But most importantly, if you can take anything away from here, it's to support independent media. News Club has been founded by a collaboration between Opus Independence and the Media Fund. We have set up a News Club Telegram channel, which you can subscribe to, and 3 times a week you'll get a bulletin with some of the top articles from the independent media. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 5 p.m. You'll get a notification with some of the best articles and videos and podcasts around from independent sources that aren't being bankrolled by corporations or by billionaires who've got vested interests, and those interests aren't the same as ours. So that's what we want you to support. That's what we want people to get involved in. You can donate to News Club as well through the Media Fund starting next week, and we'll be promoting that a little bit more then. But what we do say is sign up for the notifications, check out Byline Times, check out the Ferret, check out the Green New Deal, check out the Green Party's work. Anyone we have on board, we're saying have a look at them. Support them or not, just definitely have a look. See if you can enrich your life and have a broader and more diverse range of opinions and information. Mostly, as the Ferret pointed out, a lot of what the new media does is actually just provide information that other people don't want to bring to your attention. So do check out the independent media, sign up for the Telegram, join us each week at 5 o'clock on a Thursday, or watch it on, it will be on YouTube afterwards, and we will be clipping this up. You'll be able to get the clips on YouTube and also on all social media channels. Share those when they come out in the next few days to get some more people interested. Thanks for your comments. We'll cover more of them in the next one, and we'll see you next week, 5 p.m. Thanks very much.